Permission, Pinocchio, interruption. The purpose of this micro lecture is going to be talking about the power of giving our clients permission to eat. It's also going to talk about how to address when our client is lying. And then it's also going to talk about when is an appropriate time to interrupt a client during a counseling session. So giving permission for our client to eat can be kind of a weird thing to understand. However, you have quite a few people walking in your office or your classroom, whatever it may be, that have these strict rules. And by granting them permission, we can help them remove some of those food rules. We can help dispel misconceptions. We can reduce some of those rigid eating patterns, and hopefully we can address some of that lack of self-compassion, because oftentimes that guilt and shame about certain things in life gets projected onto food choices. Now, granting permission is different than giving instructions. So what do I mean by that? Well, as a nutrition counselor, oftentimes a big role for us is to provide education. That's considered instruction. So you can add carbohydrates to each meal, focusing on the complex carbohydrates to help you stabilize your blood sugars. Because this huge idea of low carb is the best way, I like to use this as an example right now. What about the permission aspect? Permission is going to say, well, including carbohydrates into your meals can provide a satisfaction layer because it's going to give you these extra nutrients that are more satiating for you. So it is a weird thing for even the client to give themselves permission to eat, and intuitive eating does talk about this. So these are some techniques and some practices that we want to try to implement just by shifting the language, by giving that permission versus instruction, can help remove a lot of those food rule barriers. So I want you to pause the video and I want you to think about a client or potentially maybe a friend who has unnecessary rigid food rules, or maybe they lack self-compassion if they choose to, quote, splurge and have a burger, fries, and milkshake for a meal. So what is the permission that you would grant them, and how might you phrase it? So take a moment and pause the video and write that out. Hopefully you're able to grant them that permission by letting them understand that it is okay to have a burger, french fries, and milkshake occasionally in their diet, to enjoy an environment, to celebrate, whatever the case may be. Now, what do we do when Mr. Pinocchio's nose is growing? When you're sitting inside of a counseling session and you know that your client is lying to you? It's a really weird thing to begin with when you first start out as a counselor. But it is important for you to understand how to detect it and then also understand how to address it. So why do clients lie? There's a couple different reasons, but the majority of them have to do with trying to hide something. Maybe they're fearful of criticism. Maybe they're in denial. Maybe they're addicted to food. And the biggest culprit here is shame and guilt. So because they feel like we are food police and we are going to tell them they can't have XYZ, they may lie to you when you're asking for, let's say, a 24-hour recall, and you know for a fact that they've had beer or alcohol, but they're not disclosing that. So one of the ways that we can detect when somebody is lying is by non-verbal cues, right? So the age-old, they're not making eye contact, they get a little squirmy in their chair, maybe they cross their arms. All of these are ways that we can detect. And as well as if we ask them for clarification questions. So tell me a little bit more about your beverages at your mealtime. Oh, I don't remember what I had. Okay, well, did you have water? Did you have soda? Did you have wine? Did you have beer? And you're going to be able to sense their nonverbal cue there. So how do we respond when we identify that? We really want to be problem-oriented. You know, Mr. Smith, you said that you're trying to use a smaller plate, but then when you're telling me about the different foods that you're eating, it appears that your portion sizes are a bit larger than what you originally told me. Can you please clarify that for me? We can also paraphrase and we can say, All right, Mr. Smith. So you told me last week that you enjoy alcoholic beverages, but yet you have not told me about any of them in your meals when I'm asking you to tell me what you had. Can you please provide more insight on this? Again, we don't want to attack the person, but we want to use facts and be problem-oriented. In some conditions, severe cases may need to be referred to a psychologist, especially when you're working with people who have severe eating disorders, such as binge eating or anorexia nervosa, where you know that they are lying about the foods they did or did not eat. And that's when that multidisciplinary team comes in handy. Now, what about interrupting? Sometimes as counselors, because we're really ready for that next education, or maybe we're thinking of that next question, we interrupt the client, but sometimes we need to intentionally interrupt the client. So when to interrupt the client is when the client starts wandering off topic, if you heard some change talk, or if there's limited time left in the session. So some of the ways we can go about interrupting the client is with respect, and I'll show you that on the next slide. But when it's not appropriate to share with a client or interrupt with a client is when the client is exploring reasons to make change. And if you're jumping in and asking for a secondary or a follow-up question, that can then shut them off. Or if they're expressing really strong feelings about a particular food or life choice that they're doing in relationship to their food. This is when we want them to continue on. However, we do want to keep in mind that if there is a time limit there, while they are exploring the reasons that they want to make change, or if they're expressing strong feelings, it is important to let them know, I'm sorry, Betty, but we only have 5 minutes left. I would love to hear the rest of this conversation, but keep in mind, I will need to cut you off in 5 minutes because I have another client coming in. So how do we actually interrupt that client? With respect. Excuse me, Mr. Smith. Excuse me, Betty. We always want to use our manners. We can start with an apology and say, I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones, but I only have 5 more minutes left of our session. I really appreciate you sharing this information with me, but I'm going to set a timer here for 5 minutes because I have another person coming in. But feel free to continue to share with me what you're currently sharing for the remainder of the 5 minutes. Or you can also offer, I have a thought. And you can say, we have 5 minutes left, so I want you to choose how you want to spend the rest of the 5 minutes of our counseling session in order for me to best help you. Those are just a few little tips that you can use when you can detect your client is lying, giving permission to your client, and then understanding how to interrupt and when it is appropriate to interrupt in a counseling session. I hope you enjoyed this little mini lecture.